Integrated Transport Research Lab. This breakfast seminar is co-arranged with Mistra SAMS, and we're delighted to have Professor Ian Doherty here from University of Glasgow. Before we start, just some very practical information. Come on. Coffee and sandwich over there, and please, before you leave, also sign the participation sheet here. We have 2 toilets downstairs if you need that. And yes, as I said, we're very glad to have Ian here today to talk about this very interesting topic. How can smart mobility and driverless vehicle impact public transport? So yes, very welcome, Ian, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Alban. Hey, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. You'll probably know there's a saying that academic articles on average are read by 3 people. At least 2 of them are in this room. So what I'm going to talk about today is a research agenda that I've been developing with a whole range of colleagues in the UK. This is the first paper that we've published, which I know some of you have read, which was a kind of thinking out loud exercise about what government might have to do to address all of the research that you guys do in this huge industry called smart mobility, which is estimated to be worth, what, $1 trillion within 10 years. So Greg and Gillian and I put some ideas out there about what the task for public authorities might be in the next 20, 30 years to try and think about how we govern this idea of smart mobility. We're still working on it, so some of the things I'll say today I'm really interested to get your feedback on, because we have a couple of other papers in preparation with different colleagues. This one is funded by some research that Greg and myself and Robin Dowling from the University of Sydney in Australia are doing for the UK government, thinking about this really boring thing called the curbside, except in the future it's not going to be boring at all, because it's going to be the critical interface where we as users of the smart mobility system interact with all of the technology you've got out there. So the way that we've begun to think about these issues is that for the last 70 years we've had a set of policy tools that have tried to deal with the externalities of the car and the lack of road space that causes congestion. Now, road space is a 2-dimensional entity. Curb space is a 1-dimensional entity. And given that the offer of smart mobility is all about replicating the door-to-door journey that you can have from a car, curb space we think is going to be the battleground between policy and technology in the future. And finally, and if you want to come to Lund tomorrow and hear even more, some of the less developed ideas are currently being written up in this paper, which I'm going to present with colleagues from K2, Klaus and Alexander, and also some other Australian colleagues, where we're thinking through more of the normative ideas about the challenge to this notion of public transport that we have, and also to what we think of as the city and how we interact with it, and what transport does to help us be citizens effectively. So I'm going to talk about that today, and as I say, I'm really interested to get your views on whether you think we have an argument or not, really. So I'm going to be deliberately provocative today. I'm one of those people that thinks that, and I'll be very careful and diplomatic how I pitch this, given I'm in a lab with lots of corporate logos over there that funds the work that you do, that the academic community, and particularly the social sciences community, needs to come to this agenda quickly, because smart mobility has been a major arena for academic research for 10 years now, driven by engineering possibilities. My own university is the same. We've got a leading group in sensor technology, which is the group of researchers that runs our transport research. But the social sciences have been very late to the party, and I think that we need to change that if we're not to replicate the last few decades of policy mistakes that we had with cars. So if you think about it, my potted history of this thing called the automobile is that technology came along, was kind of slow burn in many places, so it was only really in the 1950s, 60s and even 70s that car ownership really began to change how European cities functioned, but we've spent the last 40 or 50 years trying to undo the policies of that period. What I think we must avoid is history repeating itself, so that after 20 years of smart mobility being implemented and embedded in our cities and in our lives, because the engineering agenda and those producers that stand to make money from this technology are successful in introducing it, you don't want to spend the next 5 decades after that trying to unpick what we've done, having realised that it has some negative externalities. So I'll talk about what I think they are, and I'm really interested to see whether you think that that kind of critical perspective on smart mobility is helpful. Always useful to describe your terms at the beginning. So this is what I think smart mobility is. In that paper I showed you at the beginning, we took the definition of smart mobility out because none of the 3 referees could agree that we had the right definition. I've since found out who 2 of those referees were yesterday, so that conversation will continue at length. But this is how we define what we think the smart mobility system is in all these papers. So it's a kind of fuzzy idea that the vehicles and the network of hard infrastructure that provides mobility to us as individuals will somehow become more connected, both to us and to the Internet of Things, effectively using ICT. And also, and I think this is particularly important, that these ICT technologies will be used to make the mobility system much more dynamic than it is today. By dynamic, we mean not just matching supply to demand in a more efficient way than a non-smart system currently does, but also, and crucially I think, in areas such as pricing, which could become highly dynamic. And of course it will also become increasingly automated, as you know, because you can see the technology next door. So these are our key contentions that we think social science research has to bring to the party, in a sense. There is an assumption in the narratives, many of the narratives around smart mobility, that technology will fix things. Now, technology is good at fixing some things, but there are always negative externalities and unintended consequences of technological innovation. So no amount of technology per se will eliminate the need for public authorities, for government, for the state to do good policy and to govern these innovations effectively. And I think, as I've already hinted about timescales, the state or government will need to act highly proactively to make sure that the benefits from smart mobility and things like road safety, I think it's fairly well understood that there are big potential gains in safety to be had for the implementation of some of these technologies in particular places. And if we want to capture these, and if we want to minimise the negative externalities, we need to act quickly. Because once, and again, this is the history of the automobile, once the cat is out of the bag, Buchanan's famous phrase, there cannot be any going back on the automobile. The same will probably be true in smart mobility. Once we've got used to it, there will be no going back. It will just become part of our daily lives, in the way that other disruptive technologies like smartphones, for example, have become. So if we want to capture the benefits and minimise the externalities, the state has to be proactive and act quickly. And the final contention, and this is the one that we're thinking through in these new papers, and this is the one as I'm a geographer originally and then a bit of an economic historian. I probably really want to be a political scientist, and I work in a business school, so I'm a kind of social science jack of all trades, okay? But as a social scientist, this is the thing I think that interests me most, which is what are the wider implications of this technological shift and the disruption it will bring for how we act as a society and what the city, or this notion of civitas, is in future. So it's not just that the public transport system is potentially under threat from these innovations and these technologies, but also the very nature of the city and the publicness that we all enjoyed as as a benefit of the mobility that the system brings us, will change, and I would argue in some respects is under threat from these technologies, and therefore something that government should be worried about. Now, hands up, who's done a transport degree? Nobody. It's a reasonable assumption that on the first day of your transport degree, somebody will have told you that. Nods. Okay?
Yeah.
Now what then happens is for the rest of your degree, and in fact the rest of your professional career, you will go on to ignore that. Okay? What we want to do is build stuff. What we want to do is have clever, shiny vehicles, be they autonomous cars or trains or automatic buses or whatever. So this is a truism, I think, but it's one that we all forget. Constantly. Another way of saying that is this, which is one of my favourite quotes in a transport book. Now, effectively what that says is that if you look out the window of any building in the world, what you see in terms of the urban form and the place that it offers to you was dependent on the choices that people who planned its transport made at the time. So the place that we all enjoy or not in our daily lives is largely dependent on the transport technology that was available to people that built and planned it, and also the choices they made from the technologies that were available to them. The third truism, thinking that transport is a derived demand and that the transport choices we make influence the kind of place that we all live in, is that one, which is that the end user or the experience in terms of your accessibility to employment or education or healthcare or leisure or other people or whatever, the end user and their needs is the purpose of why we invest in the transport network. We all also forget that all the time. So we build stuff because we can, far too often. Just three truisms which I think remain very important. So if you take a step back and you think about the policy system and how it's sometimes good at doing things but sometimes also bad at doing things, and it makes the mistakes I've listed, I think what we always have to ask ourselves when we approach any transport investment at all, or indeed how we, society, government, approaches a disruptive innovation like smart mobility, that question. Given that transport technology structures our lives so much, the question we should always ask ourselves is, what kinds of places do we want to live in? And if you approach the policy question from that perspective, then the choices we make about how we implement technology and which technologies we choose might be very different from the ones that we currently make. Very different. Now, as if that wasn't enough medicine, I come from the Adam Smith Business School, so it's compulsory for me to talk a little bit about Smith because his work remains important several hundred years after it was written, and his most famous phrase, which you probably know, is this one. I'll let you read it. The invisible hand of the market will fix things. And we've also sociologically kind of taken that to heart and reified it so that we just think the market will work. And all too often we don't understand how the market works. And we don't understand why market actors do what they do, because it's all invisible, it'll just happen, the outcomes will be okay. And that's a kind of default assumption, especially in the Anglophone world, of course. Less so in continental Europe, granted, but all too often that's our default assumption. So I've talked about what I think the theoretical or the normative challenge to government is, and why we should be concerned about this stuff at all. The second thing I think we need to think about are producer interests. So, and you've all seen the quotes, you've all seen the videos, you know, Sergey Brin don't worry, we'll demolish motorways and cover them over with parks, and there'll be no need for car parking in cities anymore. And the fly-through videos are always accompanied by lots of children running around and all that kinds of stuff. And you know, it's like architectural drawings. You have all these big buildings, and there are some trees and one car. You know? And any architectural drawing you've ever seen, there's only one car. Well, now what you see in smart mobility drawings is one autonomous car or one bus, right? So we're being sold this narrative that smart mobility, connected automatic vehicles are going to be efficient in terms of their use of scarce resources, primarily urban space, and that they're going to give us more choice in how we move around and therefore how we live our lives. And that's what we're being sold. That's why we should want this stuff. That's why governments should support it and why they should invest in it. I think that's completely naive. If you understand how the market economy works, the proponents of smart mobility need to maximise the amount of mobility they get from the investment in technology, otherwise they wouldn't be rational actors. What's the point in having smart vehicles that are not constantly in revenue service? So they want us to travel around more, not less. Otherwise they wouldn't be acting rationally. And we also know that markets tend to default to some kind of oligopoly or monopolistic power. And you can already see that in the smart mobility arena, because you've got the big kind of 3 or 4 tech giants who've spent the last 30 years creating a kind of unhealthy, uneasy oligopoly in personal computing and then the internet and then the cloud, moving into the mobility arena to try and recreate that oligopoly in how we move around. Google, Apple, Microsoft. And the car companies, who are also rational actors in all of this, realise that when the big tech giants come into the marketplace, that even the biggest car companies in the world are small fry, and that they will become the secondary partners in a mobility offer in the smart environment, which is why you see these kind of embryonic tie-ups between the major car manufacturing groups and the tech giants already happening. So you've got highly powerful, highly rational market actors. And what do they want to do? They want to extract as high a rent as they can. You know, we had a little laugh at the beginning about, fortunately this presentation is on an Apple Mac and not a hideous Windows computer, which is masquerading over there. You know, I'll happily pay the Apple tax. Lots of us do. They extract unbelievably high rents from me because they're very good at creating things that I want to buy. And I'm not alone. That's rational. That's what these companies do, and they're exceedingly good at it. That's what they'll do when they are mobility providers. They will be exceedingly good at understanding what we want and exceedingly good at extracting money from us to give it to us. Okay? And how they do that and how they make profit is that once you're in their ecosystem, another word that we can borrow from the technology environment, and they've captured you, your data that they can then harvest is how they're able to continue to sell you more stuff and sell more stuff to you from their partners. And to say, oh, Ian, have you thought about that concert that's on over there tonight? There are 2 tickets left, buy here, and the car will be here to take you there in 10 minutes. Click. So that kind of joined up service is what we should expect. So what they want is control over you. They want control over your money and your time, because that's how they'll extract rents. So, do the technology companies want to make the places we live in any better or not? To come back to my truism. Maybe, but maybe not. It's not a clear picture. It's not like the one that they would sell to you. Now, anybody recognise that? That's a picture from the Tesla website. That's what Elon Musk wants to sell you. That's a big house in the Californian desert. It's probably at least 20 minutes away from any other human being. He's obviously fixed the water supply problem so that there's grass as well in the California desert. Because technology will do that too. And look, Tesla car. That's what the tech companies want to sell you. That's the choice that they want us to take from all the available transport technologies available to us in the 21st century. That's what they want our lives to look like. Do we want our lives to look like that? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe in American cities that have grown up in the era of the car, an electrified version of low density living and that kind of mobility will be at least better than what they have today. Maybe. In Europe, perhaps less so. So, all of that means that these new entrants to the mobility market are extraordinarily powerful. And in the social science literature, there's been all this work for 30 or 40 years about how the car companies are really powerful, how marketing works, how car ownership has become such an important part of identity for people, how that drives purchasing behaviours, all that kind of stuff, is nothing in comparison to the level of economic and cultural power that the technology giants have over the marketplace. Nothing. These are extraordinarily powerful actors, and they act very rationally, and they've got lots of resource at their disposal. So if we don't want, or if we're critical of the vision that they're selling us, we have to act quickly, otherwise it will be too late. There will be no going back on it. So what does all of this mean for public transport in practicality? I like to wind up my colleagues that work in the bus industry because I don't know the situation in Sweden, but in the UK the bus industry is under massive threat again. Passenger numbers are declining really quickly, and of course it's always everybody else's fault. It's never the product provider, it's always that there isn't enough road space made available. We don't price things properly. It's always government's fault rather than the product. But if you take a step back and you think about what a bus is, it's just a big, dirty, inflexible shared vehicle. So why should we care if there are no such things called buses left in 10 or 20 years' time? Because that's what the market might do. What is a bus? It's a big, dirty, inflexible shared vehicle. That you have no control over who you sit next to. You don't decide where it goes, etc., etc. So these technologies will implement on public transport services, will impact on them, very, very quickly. And indeed, in North America, we've already begun to do that. And then there are disruptive behaviours that we can already see. So those of you who know the road pricing literature well, and of course we're in one of the few cities in the world, never mind Europe, which has an established road pricing system. There's very few of them. There's a big literature about why pricing has not happened in many places and how government has been unable to price transport services effectively. Yet, young people will quite happily pay surge pricing on Uber. That was impossible until 5 years ago. It would never happen. Consumers would not accept that kind of dynamic pricing, and then all of a sudden it's happened without us even realising it. So behaviours are changing as quickly as the technology is disrupting the marketplace at the same time. And that, of course, is a massive, has a potentially massive effect on public transport. And it always amuses me. I don't know what your mix of students at KTH is, but at our school we have lots and lots and lots of postgraduate students from China. And at the risk of a stereotype, they won't walk anywhere because they're absolutely used to a technological lifestyle that they use Uber for everything. So they will band together and take Uber cabs between lectures. They will not walk between buildings on campus. It's extraordinary because that's just what they do, because they've grown up with it. And that technology has been available to them, so why wouldn't you do that? It's rational. So we have some choices to make. And amongst all of this, these problems are the ones that we've tried to focus on for the last, how long? 20, 30, 40, 50 years? They'll probably still be around in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. Except we'll need a whole new set of policy tools to deal with them because the technological basis of the network will change. So we'll still have congestion, we'll still have social exclusion, and we'll still have inaccessibility of key services. And I'll talk about each of these in turn in a second. I already said that and I'm taking too long already. I think this is an amazing study. It's the International Transport Forum's work on the congestion and traffic implications of autonomous vehicles. Anybody read it? Yeah? So let's think about how unaligned the narratives are here. Right? So smart mobility will transform how the urban system works, will enable us to do away with car parking, will cover the motorways in parkland and trees, and everything will be great. Okay? That's the starting point. So here's some modelling work. So let's imagine the first scenario at the top, 100% shared driverless vehicles replaces all of the car fleet in Lisbon, an average size European city. Right? Now, think about the heroically Soviet assumptions which underpin this model. Right? There is one provider of mobility. One. You have no choice in the market of how you move around. You have no choice about what kind of vehicle that provider sends to you. You have no choice about who you share it with. That's the assumptions which are behind that number, okay? You have no choice. This is the USSR for smart mobility. And look what happens. You can just about make autonomous mobility work if your objective is to reduce the number of vehicles on the streets and traffic, if you make those assumptions. Even if you keep those assumptions, so still the Soviet Union, but those choice, that service has only replaced half of the car fleet, then traffic doubles. So now let's move forward to the real world, where hopefully we still have things like democracy and a kind of social market economy and all the things that we quite like in Europe. How do we expect that set of choices to actually play out in the market? So imagine if I'm 45, right, I'm a white male. I don't drive very much, but my average person does. So why is somebody like me going to give up a BMW for a shared Hyundai? I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to say no as long as I've got the choice to say no. So all the assumptions about what we'll do for traffic and therefore congestion, everything that smart mobility producer interest would sell to us, they're just wrong. They're fundamentally wrong because they don't take into account the political economy that we work in and how market actors act and how we as consumers act. They're simply wrong. And we said so. Then there are kind of some second order effects which are also really interesting, which is that public investment in infrastructure is hard to do at the best of times. So if you're a public transport authority and you want to invest in, let's say, a new light rail line, you typically have an economic appraisal period of what, 30 years minimum? 60 years, possibly, even longer now sometimes. How on earth is it possible, anyway, to make assumptions over that time period? But given the level of potential disruption to the public transport network in these technologies, how is it possible to have any case that can be robustly defended for large-scale infrastructure investment? It isn't. And tech companies know that as well. And again, in North America, where the economic case for public transport or transit is always more difficult than in Europe anyway, we're already seeing some projects which are not going ahead because it's just too risky in the American political economy to invest money in these kinds of projects when we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So there are already public transport investments that are not happening because of the promise of smart mobility to come. Then we have these other public policy choices that are going to come and hit us, and they're going to be really hard, really difficult. So we find it hard to manage road space, and it's two-dimensional. And we've had decades worth of public policies trying to fix that one, but in the future, assuming that we share autonomous vehicles and the product offer is about door-to-door service, and remember that congestion is just demand concentrated in space and time. We're not all suddenly not going to turn up at the same time to do things. You know, we've thought that the working day will kind of flex and disappear for at least 20 or 30 years. That hasn't happened. We haven't really digitized or changed public services like health and education to get away from that timetable either. We'll still have very concentrated demand for key transport flows in the future, probably. So now what happens is the curb space becomes the public resource on which the market offer of these services depends. So if I'm sitting in the house in the morning and I want to come here, I don't want to be left a kilometre over there. I want to be dropped at the front door. I'll pay for it. So I've already shown you that, you know, dynamic pricing works, and if I will pay for it if that's what I want. So imagine what the frontages of the main streets in Stockholm are going to look like in that environment. How are we going to manage the demand for access to key economic frontages, given the level of traffic that we know will happen if we have high penetration of autonomous vehicles? And to get an early idea of what that looks like, think about curb space at an airport and how that's managed and how it's already priced. Because in lots of airports you can't drop people off for free anymore, because that's how valuable the frontage space is. You know, you can only be in certain places, so if you're a particular vehicle class, you'll get access to less prime frontage than others. It's already priced, it's already effectively privatised. That's the economic logic about autonomous vehicles and curb space and frontage that we're about to transplant into all of our cities. Are we ready for that? How are we going to do this? And then this behavioural aspect. So, you know, those of you who, if you watch what happens in the centre of town on a Friday or Saturday night, and you see people who've had a good time, that's a euphemism in Glasgow for having had lots to drink, pour out of the restaurant or the bar or the club or whatever it is and just about kind of get their phone to work and book an Uber. You've seen what happens, haven't you, about the mismatch between technology and human behaviour? How are we going to organise public space when everybody is doing that to match their mobility service to their demands? What happens if I'm late? If my autonomous vehicle appears and I'm 30 seconds late and it occupies the frontage that somebody else has already paid for? Who pays for my delay? Do I suddenly get billed for it? You already see bits of that actually in the Uber terms and conditions. So are we actually ready for the public realm to be priced and privatised in the way that it will have to be to make these things work? So again, if you look at the ITF has published a thing about curbside space this year, this spring, and it's all about a technological solution. You know, you'll have a smartphone, it'll talk to sensors in the pavement, there will be little LEDs that will flash and tell you where to go and what's up. But these technological fixes are completely unimportant in the grander scale of human behaviour and how we'll interact with these technologies. So I've spent 40 minutes being completely dystopian, I think. So let's be a little bit less dystopian. We need to be pragmatic about these technologies as well, because they will come and they do offer some benefits. So back to my example of a Friday night when the pubs closed, and I don't know whether this is the case in other cities, it's not been measured yet, but we know in Glasgow that nighttime crime has fallen massively since Uber arrived, because everybody can get home. They don't have to wander around, they don't have to battle in an hour-long queue to get a conventional cab, they don't have to do all these things that irritate people at midnight on a Friday night when they've had too much to drink. So there's a positive externality of just flooding the city with mobility means that crime has vanished, almost, just like that. So why wouldn't we like that? Well, these are the kinds of things that we have to grasp if we see them. And I think it's undoubtedly true that if we manage to zone the city carefully enough that we can capture the benefits of autonomous vehicles in safety terms, for cyclists, for pedestrians in particular, then that would be a good thing, would it not? So there are lots of benefits in these technologies that we also have to understand, and we have to organise to capture them. and we have to be pragmatic enough to think that we'll have slightly different choices in different places depending on the inheritance and where we're going. So in this latest paper, this is really thinking out loud. So in my seminar tomorrow at Lund, at K2, this is what I'm going to talk about. And this is what Kerry and John and Greg and Crystal and I are thinking through. So if we've got these technologies, and if we know that they've got potential to do some really good things, and potential to do some really bad things, how do we come up with a framework for regulating and managing them? And so the body of literature that we've used to date, and there's a little bit of this in the original Smart Mobility paper, is this idea of public value. So it comes from the public management literature, which traces a kind of timeline of how government does things from traditional direct regulatory government in the post-war period through a kind of neoliberalizing experiment which has run at greater pace and greater depth in some places rather than others. So you've got UK and US at one end of the spectrum, and places like Sweden at the other. But nonetheless, we're all kind of coming to this view now where the role of governing networks is about capturing value for shared or public purposes. So we're trying to think through what that means in an era of autonomous mobility when we think that publicness that I've just talked about, so the ability for us to enjoy the city and move around without public space being so dominated by the technology, how we find a way through that in terms of policy priorities. And these are the kinds of headings that we're thinking about. So we start at one end with things which are shorter term and more tangible, and then we move through to kind of more philosophical things at the end. So we still have to manage congestion in most cities. It's still a short-term problem. It's still a considerable economic cost. Doesn't matter which numbers you believe, they're still all relatively large. We still have to manage land use and land value effects. I mean, an unkind analysis of transport policy in most European and North American cities for the last 70 years has been about disrupting the rent value curve and making it easier for people that can afford to buy big houses further away to reduce their commuting time so they can have a big house close to the city. I think that's what most public transport investment, most roads investment has been about by and large, is it not? Disrupting the rent value curve. Autonomous mobility has the potential to do that again, and even to a greater extent than we've seen. You know, so if your journey time is guaranteed to be reliable, if you're rational, you'll travel further to do the same things, which is something we also know is true. If you can sit in the autonomous vehicle and make productive use of the time because you're not driving it. So there are land use and land value effects that we'll have to think through very carefully. The publicness or social inclusion issue is still really important. And a good example of this is that if government and the public sector spends billions of crowns or euros or dollars or whatever making the city ready for autonomous technologies, why do I want that if I only walk or cycle around? How does that democratic process include me? And if the public realm is likely to get worse rather than better, I'm a pedestrian or a cyclist most of the time, why should I want that? You need to think about these things. The placemaking agenda will not go away. I'm highly sceptical that any of these technologies will make places better, actually. Those of you who know the Buchanan report from the 60s will know the famous illustrations in it about how different places in the UK would have to change to come, as he put it, come to terms with the car. So there's this really famous illustration of Taunton Court Road, which is a major arterial road in London, turned into a kind of multi-storey roadway segregated environment where there's one level for cars, one level for public transport, and pedestrians are all isolated in little walkways. And you can see cities all around the world that started to do that and never finished it. But if I'm a pedestrian and I'm a kind of a Latin pedestrian, right? If I'm in France or Italy, so not Germany or Sweden, but if I'm a pedestrian and I don't care whether there's a green or red man with the lights, I just want to cross the road, right? Because that's how people act, really, in most cities. south of here in Europe. If I want to cross the road, what am I going to do if I know that the autonomous vehicles on the roadway will stop for me? What am I going to do? I'm just going to walk out, aren't I? I'm going to go, "Pfft," and I'm going to cross the road. So how long does it take? You could probably measure this in seconds rather than minutes. How long does it take for autonomous vehicles to become useless in that street? It takes about 3 people to do that, doesn't it? Yeah. And you can all see, we all know enough about, you've all been to new developments, urban regeneration areas which look absolutely perfect, except the architect has forgotten about the pedestrian desire line. So there's a beautiful paved path that does that, and then there's the grass that's got feet marks, it's just been trampled across, because that's what people do. Yeah, you've all seen those? That's what people will do in the urban environment. When they know the cars will stop for them, they'll just go, yeah, well. So what's the point of these technologies in lots of our cities and lots of the most valuable areas of them? Wouldn't we rather have places where people walked around and talked to each other and did all the things, again, we've been trying to rediscover for the last 50 years? That's a difficult one. And then there's the fuzziest idea of all, which is about if public transport services are under threat economically from these technologies, and if the public realm is under threat because we're going to have so many more autonomous vehicles at key points to make the system offer work, what does that do for the kind of solidarity of the city, civitas, the well-being that people derive from living in it? Because potentially that's dangerous. Again, that's not new. So you can, there's a lovely map from the last 2 American presidential elections. Actually, I should think about this and download it, which compares the census areas and how they vote with whether they have sidewalks or pavements or not. Have you seen this? No, the correlation is almost perfect. It's just beautiful. Because there is such a distinction between places where people walk around and they're at the human scale and they don't require machines or metal boxes to move us around, and the kinds of things that we do in them, and then how we think and how we behave. So thank you for listening to my dystopian vision. It's always nice to get a chance to rehearse some of these arguments, and some of them are very much thinking out loud in terms of the 2 new papers that I've got under development with colleagues at the moment, so I'll be really, really pleased to hear your views and take questions. Thank you.
Yes, we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so please.
I have a question about, you talked about the man who will not leave up his car and jump in. He will jump into the autonomous cars. But is that a realistic assumption that all of us will get into these cars?
No.
No?
And in the first paper we also talk about that.
Yeah.
So it amazes me about how academics are so selective about the literatures that they look at when they try to make arguments. So, there's a whole literature about defensible space in the 60s and 70s, and how individuals react in different enclosed spaces depending on what they are, and how they perceive their ability to act. So you're quite right. If you or I, in particular, there's a clear gender dimension to this.
Yes.
Okay, so if a woman is going to, and ladies in the audience, please tell me if I'm right here, but if you summons an autonomous shared vehicle, you're going to be quite concerned about who's in it with you, or and why they're there. But of course, you're not going to get any choice on that under the Soviet assumptions. You're going to be told that that's your only option. You have to get into something. That's just, it's not credible. And what you've begun to see is, again, the kind of technological fixes to try and solve this problem. Shared vehicles don't mean that there'll be one space. The pod might arrive and it might have some compartments in it, like a pre-war train, so that you'll know that you'll have privacy and you'll have security. It's like, what? So the solution just becomes more and more and more complex, or more and more and more incredible, literally, to solve some of these basic problems. So I just don't think that the assumptions that the whole model of smart mobility rests on are credible. in the places that we want to live in, which are called European societies. I just don't think the model as it's currently sold to us will work at all. I'll go here first.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
I
wonder.
forgot your name already.
My name is Anna Ramesh, and I'm a researcher here at KT, leading the Mistra SAMS program. But I wonder, you said very many times that it's so we are in a hurry. It's really a little time. And have you digged into what are the components of that, the time? I mean, is it because of that we are getting used to this because of the Chinese you talked about, or is the technology, the business? I mean, it's not here yet in the streets, and the companies need to make revenues to be able to do this, and they fight. We see that they fight between each other, Volvo and Liebherr and these companies. But how come? Couldn't it be so that it develops stepwise? Or what? Can you explain?
It could be. But the reason I worry about that is because if you look at which state agencies or governments are most active in supporting the actual implementation of these technologies, it's not because they want the transport benefits from them, it's because they want the economic benefits as they perceive them, either of how their cities will continue to be a focus for technological research and development. So if you go to places like Pittsburgh, where they've just given a huge part of the city over to, I think it's Google, for their autonomous driving pilot, they do that simply because it's their competitiveness strategy within the US economy to be a city where these kind of pilot projects happen, so they can attract R&D development, right? They're not interested in the transport outcomes at all. They just want to say, come to Pittsburgh and experiment, play with things. The Finnish technology system has done the same with mass, which hasn't been a great success for a set of reasons, but you know, there are other government agencies which want autonomous vehicle technologies to be developed and piloted and implemented in their jurisdictions for the economic and R&D benefits and not for the transport outcomes. So in the UK, it's the business department of government that funds and runs all the research on autonomous vehicles, almost 90% plus. It's not the transport departments. It's seen as an economic driver and about capturing research and development and patents and everything else. So effectively, we say this in the first paper, what the state is busy doing is giving away public IP because it's so desperate for investment and for R&D and innovation that it will let the tech companies do what they want, and that's why I think it won't be particularly stepwise, because it will suddenly be implemented in some places, particularly in North America, and then everybody else will feel the need to catch up. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I fear I'm not. Who was next? Anders.
Yeah. Have you thought about the geopolitical arguments in this context? Because I think companies that are going to dominate this market, that's Chinese and American companies, manage our data. So there's a point about European Union and the UK to make a counter strategy, and I see only one company in Europe that can match these huge Chinese and American companies, and that's Deutsche Bahn, perhaps. I don't know, but have you made some reflection about this as an argument when you speak to politicians?
I thought I was going to get all the way through this seminar, Anders, without mentioning Brexit.
Okay.
So, for those of us who've now been on the losing side of two referendums in Scotland and the UK in the last 4 years, this is doubly painful. And in the UK, right, we have this ludicrous public debate about what Europe is for. Right? and it's so banal. I won't trouble you with even my views on it. It's patently obvious, in a geopolitical sense, that the entire European project, since the European Coal and Steel Community and Euratom in the 1940s, has been about creating a geopolitical entity that is powerful enough that it can compete with America and China and the Soviet Union as was. Right? This is not news to anybody who understands why we have the European institutions we do, why we have the single currency, because it's a reserve currency, for the obvious reasons that Europe would like one that can compete with the dollar and with the yen and then the renminbi. These things are not difficult. And you can see in some of the Brexit technical discussions about, there's one of the things which the British media has taken huge affront to, right, is why the UK will not be allowed to participate in Galileo anymore. And the British media says, but we've spent lots of money on this, and we want it back because we want our cars to be able to drive around and use satellites. No, the reason we have Galileo is because it's part of European security, to make sure that we're not dependent on the American military for our GPS needs. But these things are so obvious, but they don't penetrate the debate. So obvious, you know, incredulously obvious. So I think your analysis is correct. I think there's probably enough innovation in the European R&D system that it's not just Deutsche Bank. The French are very good at this stuff. You know, they understood 50 years ago, and it's back to my point about economic outputs of transport investment and not transport outputs, right? The TGV was an industrial strategy tool for the French government. It wasn't really about trains. It was about having a product to sell internationally. It was about managing their national territory effectively for a whole set of reasons, and once it became clear it was about electric propulsion rather than hydrogen, it became about energy security actually, and a way of justifying the French nuclear programme. A whole set of things that are not about getting between Paris and Marseille quicker, you know, because clever people in governments understand this stuff. So I think that there's probably more potential in Europe if we join up the innovation that there is across the EU than you might think. But your basic analysis, I think, is spot on. That why would we want to give our data away in this respect? And I know we do it all the time. You know, you do it every time you pick up a phone and give your data away. But yeah, no, we haven't really done it yet in the mobility sphere. We should probably stop and think before we start to do it.
Well, I was thinking, since you have been so dystopic, maybe I could afford to be a little bit naive. That's kind of the move you get when someone takes one step. But I was thinking about your question as well, about how little time we have. And since I'm a PhD at Handelshögskolan, but I also work at Scania, and I'm also an engineer. But I think the fact that we have, why it's important to act now, is because when technology is not yet present, technology is very open, which means that you can take different paths by very easy means that you can't take in 10 years or in 5 years. So I believe that it's important to have this discussion now for those reasons, because it's not that hard to change right now, because the technology is still moving. And if these kind of discussions are ongoing, then people have the chance to do right. It doesn't mean that it will be right, but if the more of the things that we're thinking about today also makes the fact that we could actually try to do it right.
That's an excellent point. And that's reminded me about the debate on the internet and net neutrality.
Yeah.
So that we put all the components in place for an open internet 20 years ago. We did exactly what you say.
Yeah.
And now when people are trying to unpick that, it's much harder for them to do than they would otherwise do. Yeah, that's a really good point. Fully agree.
We've time for one last question. There's another.
I have another type of question. What's the difference and what's the similarities between today's taxis and these shared taxis that you talked about? You don't call them shared taxis, but I do.
That's a good question. interesting. It's back to this thing about defensible space and how people react to the vehicle or the physical environment that they're given. Philosophically, the difference between a conventional taxi with a driver and an autonomous taxi is probably the least big jump of any of the vehicle classes that we're talking about. Interesting to see how behaviour changes in that way. And I don't know the answer to that because I don't know enough about the psychology of individual behaviour. And I'll answer the question by giving you an observation about a similar technology, which is automatic checkout kiosks in supermarkets. Which you have them here, yeah?
Yes.
You've seen them all? So when they arrived, there was outrage about, no, I don't want to speak to the machine, this is terrible. You know, and an unidentified item in the bagging area and all this stuff, and people hated them. Now I love it, because the last thing I want to do when I go shopping is talk to somebody. I don't want to know about what's happened in the shop that I want to be totally antisocial, right? I want to scan my milk and my bread and walk out and not talk to anybody. So, the reason I give you that example is that if I get the train back home from London, right, and it's midnight, and I've booked a taxi so it's there, and I get in the back of the cab, and the driver starts to talk to me, right? You think, shut up! I just want to go home. So we might actually like these spaces as well. You know, we might come to think they're better than what we've got, and how behaviour will change, I don't know, but it's a fascinating question, and it could keep the behavioural psychologists in research for years.
I just want to make a reply, and that is the question of trust in society. How will trust to each other change when we don't talk to each other anymore? So that's an important aspect. Even though we love it, we feel satisfied with the solution, but as a society.
And to come back to the gender issue, I don't think we understand the profound moment that we're living through now about changes in trust and negotiation between genders that we're watching. It's still terribly show busy and kind of just, you know, remote in the way that the media covers things that happened over the last couple of years. But I think when we start to make these decisions about spaces and things like that, we'll look back on this period and find out that it's more profound than we currently understand it is.
Okay, we are unfortunately